It started as a quiet night. I was washing dishes, glancing over at her every now and then as she sat, half absent, on the couch. It wasn't like her to leave her laptop open, unlocked, and left out on the coffee table. Normally, she was almost cagey about it. But tonight, she'd gone upstairs without a word, leaving the laptop glowing under the dim living room light. I finished the dishes, wiping my hands slowly, telling myself it wasn't my business. But then I saw the open email app on her screen, a draft sitting in plain sight. I didn't recognize the recipient, Luca Di Matteo, but I recognized the way she wrote, with a tone I hadn't seen from her in maybe years. The subject line read, "Can't wait to hold you." My pulse went from a steady beat to a rapid thrum as I clicked on the draft, trying to stay rational. Maybe it was innocent, but as soon as I saw the first lines, I knew it was anything but. "Luca, my love, I'm counting down the days until I can finally leave. Just the thought of being in your arms again." I couldn't read the rest. My stomach twisted as I scrolled down, seeing email after email, long, detailed descriptions of plans she had to move in with him. Every message painted the picture of an affair that was more than a fling. She was making plans, talking about quitting her job, selling the house, uprooting her life, our life. As if I didn't exist. As if we didn't exist. I closed my eyes, swallowing hard against the fury. But I had to know more. I kept scrolling, my hands ice cold, my pulse pounding as I read her messages. I'll tell him soon. He's too clueless to notice anyway. Maybe by the time I leave, he won't even realize what's happening. I bit down hard as my jaw clenched tight. Too clueless. She thought I was too clueless. And maybe I was. Maybe I'd been too wrapped up in our routine to see what had been brewing beneath the surface. She had a way of looking right through me, of keeping her thoughts hidden, wrapped up like little secrets. But now, she'd left me the whole story, wide open in that draft folder. Then I noticed something that turned my anger to a sick feeling in my stomach. The timestamps. The messages went back over 6 months. She'd been planning this escape with him for half a year, building a fantasy where I was the obstacle, the prison guard holding her back from her true love. I glanced up the stairs, hearing the faint sound of her moving around, oblivious to the fact that her entire plan had just unraveled in front of me. For a minute, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to barge upstairs, shove the laptop in her face, and demand an explanation. But some other part of me, maybe the part that had trusted her for so long, was numb, almost paralyzed. I took a screenshot of every message, forwarding them to myself. And then I sat there, alone in the living room, the reality of it washing over me. The woman I loved, the person I'd trusted above everyone, had been plotting her exit right in front of me. My hands were shaking. I felt stupid. I felt like an idiot for not seeing it sooner. But more than that, I felt betrayed on a level I didn't even know was possible. The house felt cold, empty. Her laugh from earlier in the day echoed in my mind, a laugh I thought was shared between us, a joke only we could understand. But now it all felt like a lie. I finally snapped the laptop shut, stood, and took a deep breath. She didn't know that I knew. Not yet, and I was going to keep it that way. If she thought I was clueless, fine, because from that moment on, I was the one with the plan. That night, sleep was out of the question. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling every word of her emails replaying in my mind, stabbing at me like tiny poison needles. The temptation was there to shake her awake, demand answers, make her explain every bit of it. But I stayed silent, letting her sleep beside me as if nothing had changed. Trust, the foundation of everything we'd built, I thought. I could see now, clear as day, how she had taken that trust and twisted it, using it as a weapon against me. She'd probably banked on my loyalty to buy her time. She'd banked on my faith in her, using it to plot the life she wanted with another man. That night, I realized how vulnerable trusting someone had made me, how easy it was to be blindsided by someone who knew exactly where you were weakest. As the hours dragged on, I kept playing back all the little moments from the past few months. All the times she'd been distant, scrolling through her phone with a faint smile. The times she'd brushed off plans I tried to make, insisting she was too tired or needed a night in. I thought she was overwhelmed with work. But now, I realized those were the moments when she was probably messaging him, dreaming up this fantasy life where she got to escape me and start over. The betrayal felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about the sheer depth of her deception. She had been lying to my face, and I had been clueless. Just like she said, I got up before dawn, slipping quietly out of bed, my mind running in endless circles. I thought back to the start of our marriage, how we'd once promised to be each other's forever. We'd laughed back then about the idea of temptation, scoffing at friends who'd let their relationships go to ruins over lust, over someone new and exciting. And now, here I was, facing the reality that those same temptations, those same whispers of excitement and escape, had pulled her away from me. And not just pulled her away, obliterated what we had. She had traded it all in, sold it for a fantasy of a life on the other side of the world. A few hours later, she woke up, as oblivious as ever, stretching and yawning, smiling at me like nothing was wrong. Her ease made me sick, but I managed to keep a straight face. "Morning," she said, moving past me toward the coffee maker. "Did you sleep okay?" I almost laughed. The casualness in her tone, the everyday normalcy, was staggering. But I forced myself to stay calm, smiling back. "Yeah, just had a lot on my mind." If only she knew. The days that followed were a careful dance of pretending. I watched her closer than ever, noticing every detail. I saw the way she'd smile down at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. I heard the faint sound of her laughter from another room. Each time she smiled at her phone, each secret text she fired off felt like another jab in the gut. The anger grew, but so did something else resolve. I realized that if I confronted her too soon, I'd give her the upper hand. She'd have time to weasel her way out, make excuses, maybe even try to flip things around on me. No, I wasn't giving her that power. If she wanted to see me as clueless, I'd play along. Over those next days, I felt myself harden in ways I didn't know I could. Her betrayal had hollowed me out, yes, but it had also left a burning need to protect myself, to make sure that when she finally walked away, she wouldn't be able to take a single shred of what I had left. If this was the game she wanted to play, I was going to make damn sure she lost. And she had no idea that I'd already begun. It's strange how betrayal works on you. At first, it feels like a bomb going off, deafening, all-consuming. But over time, that explosion turns into a slow burn, spreading quietly into places you thought were safe. Every morning after that first night, I found myself drowning in memories, each one tainted now, every happy moment tinged with a new bitterness. We had spent years building a life together, creating traditions, sharing routines. Now, each one felt like a cruel joke. I'd find myself staring at old photos in the hallway, wondering if every smile she'd given me was just a practiced lie, if her mind had been drifting to someone else's arms in every "I love you." I kept replaying our past, trying to find the first crack in our marriage, that initial moment when trust gave way to betrayal. It was almost a form of punishment, but I couldn't help myself. Then there was the anger, this sharp, searing rage that came in waves, swelling up every time she brushed against me, every time she looked at me with those eyes full of secrets. But I couldn't confront her, not yet. I felt like a man holding onto a rope that was fraying in my hands, afraid that one wrong move would make everything unravel too soon. The weight of pretending was a different kind of torture. It gnawed at me every time I was around her, forcing me to act like nothing had changed, to smile when she smiled, to nod at her words when all I wanted to do was scream. But the more I watch her play this game, the more I steel myself. She thought she could hold all the cards, keep me in the dark while she carefully maneuvered her exit, her grand escape. She had no idea that I was watching her with open eyes now, and every little detail, every hint she unknowingly revealed became fuel. I began to understand the pull of temptation, not hers, but mine. The temptation to let her know I was on to her, to strip away her control and see the fear in her eyes. I wanted her to feel the humiliation she'd buried me under. But I knew I had to resist any sign of weakness, and she'd take advantage, twisting the narrative in her favor. So I held my tongue. I played along, just as she did. I started leaving early, making plans that took me away from home for hours, mirroring the behavior I'd watched her display for months. I watched her carefully to see if she noticed. Part of me hoped she'd say something, that she'd reveal her jealousy or curiosity, that she'd show me that she still cared enough to notice. But she didn't. If anything, she seemed relieved. That realization cut me in a way I didn't expect. Her indifference, her comfort in my absence, made me feel like a ghost in my own marriage. I was just a placeholder for a life she was already halfway out of. And it struck me that all these years I'd been her stability, her safe harbor, while she fantasized about something better, something more thrilling. She was secure enough in our life together to gamble it all away. That night, as I lay beside her, her breath slow and steady in sleep, I felt something shift inside me. A part of me hardened, solidified, almost as if a shield was wrapping itself around my heart. She had no idea that I knew the depth of her betrayal, and I realized that I was no longer her husband in any real sense. I was just a man biding his time, preparing for the moment I could turn the tables. For the first time since I discovered her plans, I felt calm. I finally understood what I had to do. I would make her believe that her fantasy was within reach, that her plans were safe, undisturbed. And when she was on the edge, ready to leap into the life she thought was waiting for her, I'd be there to show her just how far she'd fallen. This was no longer about saving anything we had. It was about saving myself. In the weeks that followed, I became a shadow, watching her, listening. Every word she spoke, every laugh that sounded a little too forced, every touch that felt a little too cold. I was taking it all in, letting it fuel me. The distance between us felt like a canyon, one that she'd already leapt over, leaving me on the other side alone. But while I watched her, I also felt myself changing in ways that unnerved me. I had always been someone who avoided conflict, who valued harmony, who thought love meant compromise. I never saw myself as the kind of person who would nurse secrets or hold on to bitterness like it was a lifeline. Yet here I was, my mind racing with every detail of her betrayal, counting down to a confrontation I knew would shatter everything. It's strange, the things you notice when you know the truth. She thought she was being discreet, sliding her phone out of sight the moment I walked into her room, angling the screen away just enough that I couldn't see. But I could sense her impatience, that eagerness to return to her messages with him. She probably thought she was clever, but she underestimated just how much I was paying attention now. And in those quiet moments alone, I started asking myself questions I hadn't dared to confront. What did he offer her that I couldn't? Was it the thrill of something new? The allure of a life without responsibilities? I could almost see the appeal of it, the seductive promise of escape from the mundane routines that had become our lives. Maybe that's where the real betrayal lay, in the fact that she hadn't bothered to turn to me first. She hadn't asked me to be that excitement, hadn't trusted me to be her partner in building something new. She had just decided that I wasn't enough, and instead of trying to change that, she'd look for it somewhere else. She'd chosen a stranger over me, over the life we'd spent years building. There were nights when I lay awake, wrestling with that hurt, with the need to know why. But I knew that no answer would ever make it hurt less. She'd taken my loyalty and used it as a blindfold, taking her thrills in the shadows while pretending everything was fine in the light. The deceit ran so deep that I knew I couldn't just confront her. She would find a way to deflect, to twist things until somehow I was the one in the wrong. So, I started playing my own part in the game she'd set up. I'd sit beside her on the couch, scrolling through my own phone, staying as close as I could to remind her that I was there, that I was still in the picture she was so desperate to erase. Occasionally, I'd glance over, a look of suspicion flashing across my face, just enough to unsettle her, make her wonder if I knew. She'd tense, her smile faltering, her eyes darting away. She was starting to crack, and that gave me a sick sort of satisfaction. But the truth was her discomfort was nothing compared to what I'd gone through. The loneliness, the betrayal, she could never feel it the way I had. And so, I kept watching, letting her feel the weight of my presence. The temptation to confront her, to let it all explode, was fierce. But I knew that the longer I waited, the closer she'd get to her breaking point. She had no idea that her fantasy was on borrowed time. I could almost see her reaching for that freedom she thought she'd have, convinced she'd get away unscathed. But when the moment came, I'd be there to watch the whole thing crumble, to show her what it felt like to lose everything she'd taken for granted. In those quiet, dark moments, I realized that I was no longer waiting for closure. I was waiting for justice. And that thought kept me going, even as the darkness between us grew deeper. The days blurred into each other, each one laced with tension that neither of us acknowledged. We were like actors in some twisted play, both of us pretending not to know what the other was hiding, our words polite and empty, our interactions hollow. One night, as she sat across from me at the dinner table, I noticed her glancing at her phone, her lips curving into a soft, secret smile. My heart twisted at the sight. I felt the familiar sting of jealousy, mixed with a darker impulse I hadn't known myself capable of. I wanted her to see me watching, to know that her little secret wasn't so safe. But I kept quiet, letting her believe I was too preoccupied, too clueless to notice. "Everything all right?" I asked, my voice steady, casual. She looked up, startled, her fingers tightening around her phone. For a brief second, I saw something flash in her eyes. Guilt, maybe? Or just the surprise of being caught off guard. But then she smoothed her expression, smiling as if nothing was wrong. "Yeah, just work stuff? Must be some interesting work," I replied, holding her gaze for a moment longer than I needed to. I watched her face, waiting for any sign of a crack in her facade. But she only shrugged, brushing it off with that same forced laugh she perfected over the past few months. I realized then that she was too far gone. She'd already convinced herself that this fantasy life she was building was real, that her lies were justified. I could almost see the world she'd crafted in her mind, a world where I was an afterthought, a mere obstacle on her path to happiness. It was that realization that drove me to dig deeper. If she had no hesitation lying to my face, then I had no reason to give her the benefit of any remaining doubt. Late at night, when she'd fallen asleep beside me, I'd slip downstairs and open her laptop, searching through her emails, her messages, looking for anything that would help me piece together her plans. Each message, each detail I uncovered was another twist of a knife. I discovered that her flight was already booked. In 3 weeks, she'd be gone, on a one-way ticket to Rome. She was going to visit him, she'd written, but from what I could see, it was much more than that. She was planning on staying, on leaving everything here behind. She was counting down the days. The depth of her betrayal hit me all over again. She wasn't just having an affair. She was abandoning us, erasing everything we'd built together as if it had never mattered. And then I saw the real clincher. In one of her messages to him, she'd written, "He'll be fine on his own. Honestly, I think he'll be relieved. He can just move on, find someone else. It's probably the best thing for both of us." She was rationalizing, framing it as if she were doing me a favor. That somehow, her betrayal was an act of mercy, a kindness. The absurdity of it made my stomach churn with anger and something close to disgust. She had justified this life she'd built with him so completely that she couldn't even recognize her own cruelty. But this time I felt something else, too, a cold clarity that settled over me like armor. There would be no confrontation, no argument that would end in her tears, her excuses. I was done with that fantasy. I would wait until the last possible moment, right when she was on the brink of her escape, and then I would show her exactly how well I'd been paying attention. I went to bed that night, feeling strangely at peace. She was going to learn that every secret has a price. And when the time came, I'd be there to collect. In the days that followed, every glance, every smile, every word exchanged between us became a performance. She didn't know it yet, but the stage was set, and I was pulling the strings now. Each night, I'd lie in bed next to her, the steady rhythm of her breathing filling the silence. And I'd picture her leaving, bags packed, an empty closet, her presence wiped from our home like she'd never been here. But now, every time I imagined it, a new image would form. Her face when she finally realized that I knew everything. that her plans were laid bare. I wanted her to feel that sharp, tearing shock I'd felt when I first opened her laptop, her emails. I wanted her to realize how thoroughly she'd underestimated me. The countdown was on, and I could tell by the way she moved around the house that she felt it too. She was more withdrawn, her energy focused somewhere else, somewhere far from here. There was a casual coldness in her tone, the faint impatience of someone biding their time. I could almost hear her thoughts, each one ticking closer to freedom. Then, one evening, she told me she'd be going on a business trip for the weekend. She tried to keep her voice light, but there was a nervous edge to it, as if she half expected me to see through her. It was obvious. This was the dry run, a test to see if she could leave without raising suspicion. I kept my expression neutral, smiling even, as I nodded. Of course. Go ahead. I'll keep things covered here. She looked surprised, then pleased, as if relieved that I was buying her story. She'd even thanked me, with that carefully constructed smile I'd come to hate. But inside, I felt my patience thin, my resolve hardening. I knew that when she left, she'd be running straight to him, straight to the fantasy she'd built with Luca. The night before her trip, I prepared my own plan. I called in a few favors, gathered every piece of documentation I'd been collecting, every email, every bank transfer, every bit of evidence I'd uncovered over the past few weeks. The lawyer I'd met with had been more than happy to help, impressed by the amount of preparation I'd done. I'd left nothing to chance. As she packed, I watched her from the doorway, making small talk, hiding my disdain behind a mask of casual interest. "You're really putting effort into this work trip," I commented, noting the carefully chosen outfits, the way she'd packed them with such precision. She looked up at me, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she laughed. "Well, you know how it is, first impressions and all that." I forced a smile. "Of course. I'll miss you, though." The words felt hollow, empty, but she seemed to buy them, smiling back with that same false warmth. The next morning, I watched as she walked out the door, suitcase in hand. She didn't kiss me goodbye. She barely looked back. It was as if she'd already moved on in her mind, already halfway gone. As soon as she was out of sight, I set my plan in motion. I sent copies of her messages to our lawyer, forwarded financial documents, and made sure every account was locked down, every shared asset frozen. I was done playing the fool. Then, just for the final touch, I drafted an email of my own, addressed to Luca. I kept it simple, just a few sentences, enough to get his attention. "Luca, it's time we met. I think there are a few things you should know about her life here, about who she's leaving behind, and about what she's leaving with." I hit send and leaned back, feeling a strange calm wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control, as if the power had finally shifted back to where it belonged. Now all that was left was to wait. She had her fantasy. Soon, she'd have her reality, and it wouldn't be anything like what she'd planned. I waited in silence, letting the emptiness of the house settle around me. Every minute she was gone felt like progress, as if each tick of the clock was another step toward the reckoning she'd brought on herself. 2 days passed with nothing. Then, on the third day, her message came through just after midnight. A single line, "We need to talk." The words were ice cold, void of explanation. The message sat on my screen, the silence of her betrayal finally shattered. I didn't reply. I wanted her to feel what I'd felt, alone, uncertain, desperate for an answer. By mid-morning, she'd sent 3 more messages, each one more frantic than the last. I left them unread. The afternoon dragged on, and I could almost imagine her anxiety building, the way her mind must be spinning, her entire plan unraveling in real time. Then, around 5 in the evening, the door flew open, and she stepped inside, her face twisted with confusion and something close to desperation. She looked disheveled, like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for answers she hadn't been able to find. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight. I sat on the couch, watching her, feeling that strange calm return. She was different now. This wasn't the confident, calculated woman who'd slipped out of the house days before. This was someone else, someone who'd lost control. I leaned back, crossing my arms, and raised an eyebrow. Talk about what? She blinked, thrown off by my calm, my lack of reaction. You know what I'm talking about. Her voice was edged with frustration, her mask of composure slipping. My accounts are frozen. The bank won't tell me anything, and she swallowed hard, her voice dropping to a whisper. I know you've been in my messages. I know you know about Luca. I held her gaze, letting her words hang in the air. The weight of her confession didn't even sting anymore. I'd spent weeks bracing myself for this, building up walls against the pain. Now, all I felt was a grim satisfaction. Yeah, I know, I said, my voice low. I've known for a while. She stared at me, stunned into silence, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for words that wouldn't come. You didn't think I'd figure it out, did you? I continued, watching her face contort with a mix of guilt and disbelief. You thought you could just go, disappear into your perfect little life with him, leave me in the dust. She shook her head, her hands clenched at her sides. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I thought what? I cut her off, my voice harder now. Thought I'd just lie down and let you walk all over me? Thought I wouldn't see what you were doing right in front of me. Tears pricked her eyes, but I wasn't moved. She looked so small now, stripped of her bravado, the reality of her shattered plans staring her in the face. I thought you'd understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Understand? I laughed, the bitterness pouring out of me. Understand what? That you were planning to leave me for some fantasy? That you thought you could just rewrite our life and walk away without consequence? She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. For the first time, she looked lost, her world of lies caving in around her. I let her stand there, taking in the weight of everything she destroyed. Finally, she dropped her gaze, her shoulders sagging. I didn't know you'd find out like this. I thought it'd be easier for both of us. Easier, I echoed, my voice dripping with disbelief. You're unbelievable. The silence stretched out between us, thick and final. I stood, my eyes fixed on her, and for the first time, I saw her clearly, not as the person I'd loved, but as someone willing to erase our life together for a fantasy that had already crumbled. Don't come back here, I said, my voice steady, each word a final nail in the coffin of our marriage. Pack your things and go. You want a new life? Now you're free to find it. Just don't expect me to be here when you come crawling back. She looked up, eyes wide with panic, but I didn't wait for her response. I turned and walked away, leaving her in the empty house, the weight of her choices finally crashing down. She was still there when I came downstairs the next morning, sitting on the couch with her face buried in her hands. She hadn't slept. I could see it in the darkness under her eyes, in the way her fingers trembled as she looked up at me. But any sympathy I might have felt was long gone, burned out in the hours I'd spent awake, wrestling with the aftershocks of her betrayal. I'll get my things, she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. There was a part of me that almost felt sorry for her, watching her look around the room like she was seeing it for the first time. All the pictures on the walls, the souvenirs from trips we'd taken, the tiny pieces of our shared life. They were just reminders now, fragments of a life she'd left behind before she'd even packed a bag. She didn't belong here anymore, and for the first time, I realized that I didn't want her here either. She stood up, moving slowly, almost like she was hoping I'd stop her, give her some kind of opening to explain herself. But I just watched her in silence, giving her nothing to hold on to. This was her mess, her choice, and I wasn't about to make it easier for her. I followed her up the stairs, not out of concern, but to make sure she didn't take anything she wasn't entitled to. I watched as she packed her clothes into a suitcase, her hands moving slowly, mechanically. She paused once, glancing at a picture of us from our wedding day, her eyes clouding over. Was any of it real? I asked, the words spilling out before I could stop myself. The question had been gnawing at me for weeks, but I hadn't let myself say it out loud, hadn't wanted to give her the satisfaction of knowing how deeply she'd cut me. But now, watching her stare at the evidence of what we'd once been, I couldn't hold back. She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed, searching my face as if hoping to find a glimmer of forgiveness. Of course it was real, she whispered, her voice cracking. I never wanted it to end like this. I lost myself somewhere along the way. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. Lost yourself? That's what you call it? She flinched, looking away. I know I've hurt you. I know I made a mistake, but I didn't plan for it to happen like this. I thought I could have something for myself, something that would make me feel alive again. The words hit me like a punch. She was saying it as if I was the one who'd trapped her, as if I'd been the thing that made her feel dead inside. The excuses, the self-justification, it was all too much. So that's it? I asked. You throw everything we built away for a fantasy, and then you have the nerve to say you lost yourself? What about what I lost? She didn't answer. She couldn't. And the silence that stretched between us was thicker than anything I'd ever felt, like a wall neither of us could break through. She kept packing, her head down, her shoulders hunched, like she was trying to shrink into herself. When she finally finished, she stood in the doorway, her suitcase by her side, looking back at me one last time. I know you probably don't believe me, but I loved you. I still care. I shook my head, feeling a strange, dull ache settle into my chest. You cared for yourself, and you loved the idea of me as long as it didn't get in the way of whatever you thought you wanted. That's not love. She stared at me, her face pale, defeated. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of understanding, of realization. But it didn't matter anymore. Without another word, she walked past me, pulling her suitcase down the stairs, each step echoing like the last nail in the coffin of what we'd once had. The front door opened and then closed with a heavy, final thud, leaving me alone in the house that was now mine alone. The silence that filled the space after she left was deeper than anything I'd ever felt. But this time it felt different. It wasn't the silence of lies, of hidden things lurking just out of sight. It was clean, empty, a quiet that allowed me for the first time to breathe. And in that silence, I knew that whatever came next, it would be mine, untouched by her betrayal. After she left, the house felt like a shell. The silence was so thick it was almost a presence itself, wrapping around me, daring me to fill it. For the first time, I was alone, truly alone, with no distractions, no half-hearted conversations to distract me from the reality that my life, as I'd known it, had crumbled. I wandered through the rooms, taking it all in. Her absence was everywhere. In the empty spots where her shoes used to be, the blank patches on the wall where she'd taken down her favorite paintings. Even her scent, faint and fading, was like a ghost haunting the air, the last remnants of a life that had slipped right through my fingers. The first night, sleep was out of the question. My mind was a storm of questions, each one louder than the last, each one twisting the knife deeper. How had I missed it? Was there something about me that had pushed her away? The memories looped in my head like a reel, each one darker than the last, a maddening carousel of moments I couldn't change. But as the hours wore on, something shifted. Beneath the questions, beneath the raw hurt and the jagged edges of betrayal, a strange, quiet clarity began to emerge. For months, maybe even years, I had been holding on to a version of her that had stopped existing long ago. I'd been clinging to memories of who she used to be, of who I thought we were together. I let myself believe that we were still those people. And in doing that, I let her drift further and further away, so far that I couldn't even recognize her anymore. I realized then that her betrayal, painful as it was, had set me free. I wasn't trapped anymore, trying to make something work that had been broken for far longer than I'd wanted to admit. For the first time, I was free to build my life on something real, something honest, without the weight of someone else's lies pulling me down. The next day, I forced myself to go through her things, whatever she hadn't taken with her, the bits and pieces she'd left behind. It felt like peeling away layers of myself, stripping down to something raw and painful, but it also felt necessary. I found old photos, love notes from when we were young and foolishly in love, mementos from trips that had once meant everything. And then, in the back of her closet, I found a box I'd never seen before. Inside were letters she'd written to him. each one confessing something I hadn't known, each one erasing any last vestige of doubt. In her words, I could see her justifications, her little lies to herself, all the ways she'd rewritten our story to make herself feel blameless. Reading them, I felt a mixture of pity and disgust. She hadn't just betrayed me, she betrayed herself, too, losing sight of everything we'd once held sacred. And in that moment, I realized that any remaining part of me that had clung to her, that had hoped for some kind of reconciliation, was gone. By the time I finished, the numbness was gone, replaced by a strange, exhilarating lightness. I took the letters, the memories, the photos, and one by one I packed them away. I wasn't erasing the past. I was giving it closure, letting it take its place as something I'd survived, something I could move on from. That night, I poured myself a drink and sat on the back porch, watching the stars glint against the dark, endless sky. For the first time in years, I felt no tension, no tightness in my chest, no creeping doubt. There was only a quiet peace, a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. The future was unknown, and there was a part of me that felt terrified at the thought of rebuilding from the ground up. But there was also freedom in that fear, a wild, boundless freedom that I knew I could grow into. In that darkness, surrounded by silence, I allowed myself a rare smile. The life I'd lost wasn't the life I needed, and as I stared into the open night, I realized that whatever lay ahead, it would be built on truth, on honesty, and, most importantly, on my own terms. For once, the path was mine alone, and I was ready to take it. The days following her departure passed in a strange, quiet blur. Without her there, the house felt like a new place, as if it were shedding the weight of her lies just as I was. Each morning, I'd wake up to an open, still silence that had once felt suffocating, but now felt liberating. At first, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. Every object in the house felt like a reminder of what we'd shared, of the life I thought we'd been building together. But I realized that I didn't have to keep anything I didn't want. I started with the bedroom, tossing the sheets, her old clothes, her half-empty perfume bottle, all traces of her swept away. I opened the windows, letting in fresh air, and suddenly the room felt new, like it belonged only to me. One evening, as I sifted through an old drawer, I found a stack of notes I'd written to her over the years. Little gestures I'd left for her on birthdays, anniversaries, the small things that had once been tokens of love. The irony hit me. I had spent so many years trying to show her my devotion, only to find out that it had all been misplaced. I felt an urge to throw the notes away, to banish every memory of her, but instead I folded them carefully, putting them in a box labeled Lessons Learned. It was a painful reminder, but one I knew I'd need to remember. My friends noticed the change. I started showing up for drinks and poker nights, things I'd often skipped out on, thinking she was waiting for me at home. One night, my closest friend, Mark, pulled me aside. "You're different, man," he said, clinking his glass against mine. "It's like a weight's been lifted off you." I looked at him, surprised at how much truth was in his words. "Maybe it has," I said, realizing it for myself. "Feels like I'm finally seeing everything clearly." He gave me a knowing smile. "Good. You deserve it." Later that night, I went home and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of me. I started writing, just letting the words flow. Everything I'd felt, every thought I'd wrestled with over the past few months. The anger, the betrayal, the regret, all of it poured out, scrawled in my own messy handwriting. But as I wrote, I noticed something new, something that had been missing in all those late-night conversations with myself. Forgiveness. Not for her. That was beyond me. But for myself. I realized I'd spent so much time questioning my worth, wondering if there had been something I could have done differently, something that would have kept her from straying. But the truth was, I'd been enough. Her choices had nothing to do with my value or with what I had or hadn't done. They had only been a reflection of her own emptiness, her own selfishness. As I finished, a sense of calm settled over me, deeper and more peaceful than anything I'd felt in years. It was over. Truly, finally over. And more than that, I was free. Free to redefine my life on my own terms. Free to build something genuine, something grounded in honesty. I folded the letter and tucked it into the box with the other notes, a final farewell to the life I'd left behind. I didn't need to dwell on the betrayal anymore. I didn't need to let it define me. That night, I fell asleep with the windows open, feeling the cool night air fill the room. And when I woke up the next morning, I felt light, ready to take on whatever was waiting for me. The weight of her betrayal had once been all I could feel. But now, it was only a memory, a reminder of a closed chapter. Ahead of me lay something new, something untouched by lies, something I could build for myself. And for the first time, that future felt like enough.